Most people spend their lives searching for something they call magic, meaning fulfillment or purpose, imagining that it exists somewhere far away, in a different relationship, a different job, a different version of themselves, or some future moment when everything finally comes together. And yet, there is a simple and unsettling idea that keeps appearing across philosophy, psychology, and spiritual traditions, an idea that many people feel in their bones but rarely want to face directly, and that is this. The magic you are looking for is hidden in the very work you are avoiding, because avoidance is not laziness. It is fear dressed in comfort. It is the quiet decision to look away from what feels too heavy, too painful, too uncertain, or too revealing, and so instead of meeting life directly, many of us slip into what could be called autopilot mode, a way of living where the body moves, the mind reacts, the days pass, but no one is truly home inside, and in this mode we are not living consciously. We are being lived by habits, by old wounds, by unexamined beliefs, and by forces in our environment that decide for us how we feel, what we value, and how we respond. When we avoid something long enough, it doesn't disappear. It simply moves into the background and begins to run the show from there. And this is how denial works, not as a dramatic refusal of reality, but as a subtle numbing, a soft closing of the eyes, where we tell ourselves stories like, "I'll deal with this later, it's not that important," or "this is just how life is." And slowly, without realizing it, we begin driving the car of our lives with our eyes closed, not knowing where the steering wheel is, not knowing how the brakes work, not even knowing what direction we're moving in, and yet still pressing forward out of momentum rather than intention. In autopilot mode, the locus of control shifts almost entirely to the outside world, meaning our moods, reactions, and sense of worth are dictated by circumstances, other people's behavior, social expectations, and old conditioning. And when something goes wrong, we instinctively project our inner chaos outward, blaming the job, the relationship, society, our parents, our past, or even ourselves in harsh and unhelpful ways, rather than recognizing that much of what we are reacting to is not the present moment at all, but unresolved material from earlier chapters of our lives that we never pause long enough to understand. This is why avoidance feels safe in the short term but costly in the long term, because what we avoid does not shrink, it grows, it gains weight, it gains influence, and it begins shaping our choices invisibly, and eventually we wake up one day feeling lost, anxious, resentful, or empty, not because life failed us, but because we were not fully present for it. And this is what the ancient philosophers meant when they said that the unexamined life is not worth living, not as a moral judgment, but as a description of a life that is being lived mechanically, rather than consciously. To examine life does not mean to criticize it endlessly or analyze it into pieces. It means to turn toward it, to look honestly at what we feel, what we fear, what we desire, and what we avoid. Because avoidance is often pointing directly at the doorway we need to walk through, and the work we resist is rarely the work of productivity or achievement. It is the work of attention, responsibility, and truth, the work of noticing how we actually live rather than how we imagine we do. Consider how many people avoid silence, because in silence, the mind begins to speak, and what it speaks of is not always pleasant. It speaks of regrets, unmet needs, old grief, fear of death, fear of meaninglessness, fear of being seen, and fear of being honest with oneself. And so, rather than listening, we distract ourselves with noise, with screens, with constant busyness, with stimulation, not realizing that we are avoiding the very space where clarity might arise. Because clarity is rarely loud. It is quiet, and it asks us to slow down enough to feel what we have been running from. Avoidance also shows up in how we relate to others, where we avoid difficult conversations, avoid setting boundaries, avoid admitting when something no longer fits, and in doing so, we slowly build lives that are misaligned with who we truly are, and then we wonder why we feel drained, irritable, or disconnected, not realizing that the energy we lose is not from effort, but from suppression, from constantly holding parts of ourselves down so they do not disturb the image we are trying to maintain. The metaphor of driving a car with your eyes closed is powerful because it captures how absurd and dangerous this way of living actually is, and yet how normal it has become, because many people have never been taught how to drive consciously, how to recognize their inner controls, how to feel when to slow down, when to change direction, when to stop, and instead they inherit patterns from family, culture, and society that reward speed, productivity, and conformity over awareness, depth, and authenticity. When the locus of control is external, life feels like something that happens to us rather than something we participate in, and this is why people feel trapped, powerless, or chronically anxious, because anxiety is often the nervous system's response to living in a world where you feel you have no say, where you are constantly reacting rather than responding, and response requires awareness, while reaction only requires conditioning. To respond is to pause, to notice, to choose, while to react is to repeat, and repetition is the hallmark of autopilot living, where the same patterns play out again and again, the same conflicts, the same disappointments, the same emotional loops, and we call it fate or bad luck, not realizing that what feels like fate is often unexamined habit. And yet, there is a deeper layer to this, because avoidance is not simply personal failure, it is deeply human, and in many ways it is understandable, because to face life directly is to face uncertainty, suffering, and impermanence. And these are not comfortable truths. And so autopilot becomes a kind of collective agreement, a way of functioning without having to look too closely at what it all means. But here is where the quote returns with quiet insistence. The magic you are looking for is in the work you are avoiding. Because what you avoid holds energy, information, and potential. And when you finally turn toward it, not with force, but with curiosity, something shifts. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. And this is where real change begins, not in external circumstances, but in the relationship you have with your own experience. The work you avoid might be grieving something you never allowed yourself to grieve. It might be admitting that a certain identity no longer fits. It might be feeling anger you were taught was unacceptable, or acknowledging a desire you buried because it felt impractical or selfish. And when these parts remain unconscious, they drive behavior indirectly. But when they are brought into awareness, they lose their grip, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer in the dark. Living consciously does not mean becoming perfectly self-aware or free from fear. It means being willing to see what is actually happening inside you, moment by moment. And this willingness is itself transformative, because attention has a way of reorganizing experience without force, much like light changes what it touches simply by being present. This is why so many spiritual traditions emphasize awareness over control, presence over perfection, and acceptance over resistance, because resistance consumes enormous energy, while acceptance opens space, and in that space, choice becomes possible again, and choice is what returns the steering wheel to your hands. When you open your eyes while driving your life, you may realize that you don't know exactly where you're going, but you can finally see the road, and seeing the road does not guarantee certainty, but it allows for responsiveness, for learning, for adjustment, and this is infinitely more alive than moving blindly in a direction you never chose. The unexamined life is not worth living, not because it is immoral, but because it is unconscious, and consciousness is what allows life to be experienced as meaningful rather than mechanical, and meaning does not come from answers, it comes from engagement, from participation, from being present for the unfolding rather than numbing yourself to it. And so the invitation is gentle, not dramatic, not urgent, but persistent. Notice what you are avoiding, not to judge it, not to fix it immediately, but simply to see it, because seeing is the beginning of freedom, and freedom does not mean escaping life's difficulties. It means meeting them with awareness rather than fear. And when you do, you may discover that what you thought was a burden is actually a doorway, and what you thought was magic was simply attention all along. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe for more.